He looked like any other quiet farmer loading supplies into his wagon, but when Gideon Marsh spotted the purple bruise beneath Cora's powder that morning, everything changed. The blonde cook tried to smile as she served his usual coffee, but her trembling hands told a different story. What he did next would tear their peaceful town apart and force every soul to choose a side. Gideon had been coming to Harper's Tavern every Tuesday morning for 3 years, always ordering the same black coffee and cornbread. The routine never varied, and neither did his observation of the pretty blonde woman who worked behind the counter. Cora Lane had caught every man's attention when she first arrived in town, but she kept to herself, focused on her work with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. This morning felt different. As she poured his coffee, Gideon noticed how carefully she angled her face away from the morning light streaming through the tavern's windows. The powder on her left cheek couldn't quite hide the dark purple shadow beneath her eye. Her golden hair, usually neatly pinned back, hung loose on one side as if to create a curtain of privacy. "Morning, Mr. Marsh," she said softly, her voice carrying the slightest tremor. Her fingers wrapped around the coffee pot handle tighter than necessary, knuckles white with tension. Gideon nodded slowly, his weathered hands steady as he accepted the cup. He was a man of few words, known throughout the county for his measured silence and careful observations, but his dark eyes took in every detail, the way she flinched when footsteps approached from the kitchen, how she kept glancing toward the back door as if calculating an escape route. Malachi Brooks emerged from the kitchen, his heavy boots announcing his presence before he appeared. The tavern owner was a large man with thick arms and a voice that carried authority throughout the establishment. He surveyed his domain with the confidence of someone who believed he owned everything he could see, including the people who worked for him. "Cora, table 4 needs their breakfast," he said, his tone sharp enough to make her shoulders tense. When she moved to comply, Gideon noticed the slight limp in her step, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. The farmer sipped his coffee slowly, processing what he'd observed. In his 42 years, he'd learned to read situations like other men read books. The signs were all there, painted across Cora's careful movements and hidden beneath her attempted composure. Someone had hurt her, and recently. As Cora served the other customers, Gideon watched Malachi's behavior toward her, the way the tavern owner's eyes followed her movements, the possessive undertone in his voice when he spoke to her, the subtle way he positioned himself to block her path to the front door. Each interaction added another piece to a picture Gideon didn't want to complete. The morning crowd began to thin, and Cora moved efficiently between tables, clearing dishes and wiping surfaces. But when she reached for a plate on a high shelf, her sleeve rode up, revealing finger-shaped bruises wrapped around her wrist like a dark bracelet. That's when Gideon made his decision. He stood up from his usual table, leaving exact change beside his empty cup, and walked directly to where Malachi stood counting receipts behind the bar. The tavern owner looked up with the practiced smile he reserved for paying customers. But what happened next would change everything about their quiet town. And some secrets were about to surface that would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about the people they lived alongside. "Need to speak with you outside," Gideon said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority, despite its low volume. His eyes never left Malachi's face, studying the man's reaction with the patience of someone accustomed to reading cattle and weather patterns. Malachi's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Course, Gideon. Always got time for one of my best customers." But his hand moved instinctively to rest on the bar's edge, fingers drumming once against the worn wood. They stepped outside into the crisp morning air, where Gideon's wagon waited loaded with supplies from the general store. The main street was mostly empty except for a few early risers heading to work, their boots creating small clouds of dust with each step on the dry ground. "Your cook," Gideon began, then paused, choosing his words with the same care he used when breaking wild horses. "She seems to be having some difficulties." Malachi's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his friendly demeanor. "Cora? She's fine. Clumsy girl sometimes, always bumping into things. You know how women can be." He let out a forced laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "That's so?" Gideon stepped closer, close enough that Malachi had to look up to meet his gaze. Despite being shorter than the tavern owner, something in the farmer's presence made the space between them feel charged with tension. Funny thing about accidents, they tend to happen in patterns when they're not really accidents. The pretense dropped from Malachi's face like a mask falling away. "You'd best mind your own business, Marsh. What happens in my establishment with my employees ain't your concern. Maybe not, Gideon replied, his voice steady as bedrock. But what I'm making it my concern now. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. I'm offering to buy out her employment contract. Whatever you're paying her, I'll double it for her to come work my land. Malachi's face darkened. The friendly tavern owner disappearing entirely. She ain't for sale, and she ain't going nowhere. That girl knows where she belongs. Every person has the right to choose their own path, Gideon said, his hand resting casually near his belt. Question is, whether you're going to respect that right or if we're going to have a different kind of conversation. From inside the tavern came the sound of breaking glass, followed by Cora's muffled cry. Both men turned toward the noise, but Gideon moved first, pushing past Malachi toward the door. You don't want to go in there, Malachi warned, grabbing Gideon's arm. Some things are better left alone. But Gideon shook off the grip with surprising force and headed for the tavern entrance. What he found inside would prove that some problems couldn't be solved with money or polite conversation, and the quiet farmer was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. Cora knelt on the tavern floor, carefully picking up pieces of shattered ceramic from what had been a serving platter. Her blonde hair had fallen forward, creating a curtain that couldn't quite hide the fresh red mark across her cheek. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the scene with harsh clarity. Clumsy again, she whispered, not looking up as Gideon entered. Her fingers moved quickly among the sharp fragments, as if speed might somehow make the situation disappear. Gideon crouched beside her, his movements deliberate and calm. Leave those pieces, he said quietly. Someone else can clean them up. No, I have to, she began, but stopped when their eyes met. For the first time he saw the full extent of what she'd been hiding. The bruise around her eye was darker than he'd initially thought, and there were others. A purple mark along her jaw, finger-shaped impressions on her throat that powder couldn't completely conceal. Who did this to you? He asked, though they both knew the answer. Cora glanced toward the kitchen door, fear flickering across her features. Please don't make trouble. It'll only get worse for me. Worse than this? Gideon gestured gently toward her injuries. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. You don't understand. He owns my employment contract. Says I owe him money for room and board, for the clothes on my back. Every time I try to leave, the debt gets bigger. Last night I mentioned wanting to send money to my sister back east, and she touched her cheek unconsciously. Malachi's heavy footsteps approached from behind them. Problem here, Cora? Gideon rose slowly, placing himself between the tavern owner and the kneeling woman. The only problem is a man who thinks ownership papers give him the right to use his fists. You're trespassing now, Marsh. I want you out of my establishment. I'm not leaving without her. The tension in the room became palpable as other patrons began to notice the confrontation. Two local ranch hands at the corner table stopped their conversation to watch. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, paused in her morning tea to stare openly at the scene unfolding before her. That girl has debts to pay, Malachi said, his voice rising. Legal debts. You can't just walk in here and steal my property. She's not property, Gideon replied, his tone remaining level despite the fire in his eyes. She's a human being, and human beings have rights. Cora stood up slowly, still clutching pieces of broken pottery. Please, both of you, just stop. This isn't worth fighting over. Yes, it is, Gideon said without taking his eyes off Malachi. Some things are always worth fighting for. Malachi stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. You think because you've got some land and a few head of cattle that makes you somebody important? This is my town, my business, my rules. Your rules don't include beating women. The tavern had gone completely silent now. Even the ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Mrs. Henderson's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, the small sound echoing in the hushed space. But what happened next would shatter more than just pottery, and the consequences would ripple through their small community in ways none of them could have predicted. Malachi reached for the shotgun he kept beneath the bar, but Gideon moved faster than anyone expected from a man known for his slow, deliberate nature. His calloused hand clamped down on Malachi's wrist with the strength of someone who'd spent decades working with 1,000-pound bulls. I wouldn't, Gideon said quietly, his grip tightening until Malachi winced. Let go of me, Malachi snarled, trying to wrench free but finding himself held fast by fingers that felt like iron bands. Mrs. Henderson gasped and dropped her teacup entirely this time, the porcelain shattering against the wooden floor. The ranch hands at the corner table exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene or flee. One of them, a young man named Pete, started to rise from his chair. "Stay seated," Gideon said without looking at him, his voice carrying absolute authority. Pete sat back down immediately. Cora watched in stunned silence as the two men faced off, neither giving ground. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Malachi before. The tavern owner ruled his establishment with an iron fist, and most people in town either feared him or owed him money. Sometimes both. "You're making a mistake, Marsh," Malachi said through gritted teeth. "I got friends in this town, important friends. Sheriff Davies, Judge Morrison. They won't take kindly to you manhandling a respected businessman." "Then they can take it up with me," Gideon replied, "after I've had my conversation with them about what kind of business you're really running here." The front door of the tavern opened, and Sheriff Davies himself walked in, drawn by the commotion. He was a portly man in his 50s, with a badge that seemed to weigh heavily on his chest, and a mustache that had seen better days. "What's all the fuss about?" Davies asked, taking in the scene before him. His eyes moved from the broken pottery on the floor to Cora's bruised face to the two men locked in their standoff. "Sheriff, arrest this man," Malachi demanded, still trapped in Gideon's grip. "He's attacking me in my own establishment." Davies looked to Gideon, his expression unreadable. "That true, Gideon? You causing trouble in Malachi's place?" "Depends on how you define trouble," Gideon replied, finally releasing Malachi's wrist. "I'd say the real trouble is what's been happening to Miss Lane here." He gestured toward Cora, whose injuries were impossible to ignore in the bright morning light. Sheriff Davies studied Cora's face for a long moment, his expression growing troubled. "Those are some nasty bruises, miss. How'd you come by them?" Cora opened her mouth to speak, then glanced nervously at Malachi. I fell down the stairs yesterday evening. Clumsy of me." "Stairs, you say?" Davies scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Funny thing about falling downstairs. Usually leaves bruises in different places. Those marks on your neck don't look like they came from any fall." The sheriff's observation hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly everyone in the tavern understood that this confrontation was about to become something much more serious than a simple dispute between two men. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 1 p.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter, because out here in the West, no one waits around. Malachi's face went pale as Sheriff Davies stepped closer to examine Cora's injuries. "Now hold on there, Sheriff. You've known me for 15 years. I'm a pillar of this community, a God-fearing businessman who's never had so much as a complaint filed against me. That's because people are afraid to file complaints," Gideon said quietly. "Fear has a way of keeping folks quiet." Davies nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. "Miss Lane, I need you to tell me the truth about these injuries, and I need you to know that whatever arrangement you might have with Mr. Brooks here, the law is bigger than any contract or debt." Cora's hands trembled as she looked between the three men. Her whole body seemed to shrink inward, as if she could somehow disappear from the situation entirely. "I don't want any trouble," she whispered. "Trouble's already here," Davies replied gently. "Question is whether we're going to deal with it, or let it keep growing." Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening intently from her table, suddenly spoke up. "Sheriff, I've seen that girl coming to work with suspicious injuries at least 3 times in the past month. Always had an explanation, always seemed scared to talk about it." Malachi whirled around to face her. "You keep your mouth shut, old woman. This ain't your business." "Don't you dare speak to my wife that way," came a new voice from the doorway. Judge Morrison himself had arrived, drawn by the crowd gathering outside the tavern. He was a tall, dignified man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The two men Malachi had claimed as allies were now standing in his tavern, witnessing firsthand the evidence of what he'd been doing to Cora. "Judge Morrison," Malachi said, forcing his voice to sound respectful. "Good to see you this morning. Just a little misunderstanding here." Morrison looked at Cora's battered face, then at the defensive posture of the tavern owner, then at Gideon's calm but determined expression. The only misunderstanding I see is a man who thinks he can treat another human being like livestock. Cora suddenly found her voice, perhaps emboldened by the presence of law enforcement and a judge. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd sell my contract to the mining camps up north. Said those men aren't as gentle as he is. Her voice broke on the last words. The tavern fell completely silent except for the sound of Cora's quiet sobbing. Even the ranch hands looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats as the full horror of the situation became clear. Judge Morrison's face hardened like granite. Mr. Brooks, you're under arrest for assault and unlawful imprisonment. Sheriff Davies, please place this man in custody. You can't do this, Malachi protested as Davies moved toward him with handcuffs. I have rights. I have contracts. So does she, Gideon said firmly. And her rights don't disappear just because you have a piece of paper. But as the sheriff moved to arrest Malachi, the tavern owner made one last desperate play that would turn the entire situation on its head and reveal secrets that would shake the very foundation of their small town. Wait! Malachi shouted as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. You want to know the truth? I'll tell you the real truth about your precious Cora Lane. Everyone in the tavern froze. Cora's face went white as fresh snow, and she took a step backward as if physically struck. Judge Morrison, you remember the bank robbery 2 years ago? The one where they never caught the inside person who helped those outlaws? Malachi's voice carried a note of triumph despite his circumstances. Well, your innocent little victim here was the one who gave them the information about when the shipments came in. Sheriff Davies loosened his grip on Malachi's arm, confusion written across his weathered features. What are you talking about? She came to town under a false name running from the law. Her real name is Clara Beaumont, and there's still a warrant out for her arrest in 3 counties. I've been protecting her all this time, giving her a place to hide. Cora's knees buckled, and she caught herself against the bar. That's not... You don't understand. Don't I? Malachi continued, sensing he'd found his leverage. You think I kept you around because I needed a cook? I knew exactly who you were from the day you arrived. Been keeping your secret safe, and this is how you repay me? Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from anger to careful consideration. These are serious accusations. Mr. Brooks, do you have any proof of these claims? Malachi nodded toward a locked box behind the bar. Check the second drawer. There's a wanted poster with her picture on it, and letters she wrote to her sister confessing everything. Gideon stepped closer to Cora, his presence steady despite the shocking revelations. Is any of this true? Cora looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. My name is Clara, yes, but I never helped rob any bank. My brother did, and when they couldn't find him, they blamed me. Said I must have known about his plans, must have helped him somehow. That's not what the evidence showed, Malachi said smugly. Letters in your own handwriting, detailing when the bank received its largest deposits. Letters my brother stole from me, Clara protested. I worked as a clerk there. I wrote those letters to warn my sister about his gambling debts, to tell her he'd been asking questions about my work. I never thought he'd use the information to. Sheriff Davies examined the wanted poster Malachi had produced. The resemblance was unmistakable, though the woman in the drawing looked harder, more desperate than the person they knew as Cora. Even if this is true, Gideon said quietly, it doesn't give anyone the right to beat her, doesn't it? Malachi asked. I've been keeping a criminal safe from the law. Seems to me that gives me certain privileges. But what no one in that room realized was that the real truth was far more complicated than either story they'd heard, and before the day was over, everyone would learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one you never suspect. Judge Morrison took the wanted poster from Sheriff Davies and studied it carefully. The resemblance is strong, I'll grant you that. But Miss Clara, these are federal charges. Bank robbery is a hanging offense. Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. Judge Morrison, I swear on my mother's grave, I never helped my brother rob that bank. When I realized what he'd done with the information in my letters, I tried to turn him in myself. But he'd already disappeared, and the authorities decided I was easier to blame than admitting they'd lost him. Gideon studied the faces around him, his farmer's instincts reading the situation like he would read approaching weather. Something didn't fit right. Malachi, if you knew she was wanted by the law, why didn't you turn her in for the reward money? Man like you doesn't usually pass up easy profit. Malachi's confident expression faltered for just a moment. I felt sorry for her. Gave her a chance to make an honest living. By beating her? Sheriff Davies asked skeptically. I never, Malachi began, then stopped as he realized he'd been caught in a contradiction. Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, suddenly stood up from her table. Malachi Brooks, you're a liar and worse than a liar. All eyes turned to the banker's wife, surprised by her forceful tone. I've been keeping quiet about this for too long, she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. My husband told me in confidence about irregularities in Malachi's account. Large cash deposits that couldn't be explained by tavern income. Money that appeared right after that bank robbery. The silence in the room was deafening. Malachi's face went from pale to flushed, to pale again. That's ridiculous, he stammered. Your husband has no right to discuss private banking matters. He doesn't, Mrs. Henderson agreed. But when he saw how you were treating this poor girl, he realized the deposits might be connected. You weren't protecting her from the law, Malachi. You were using her as a shield to hide your own crimes. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Are you suggesting that Mr. Brooks was involved in the bank robbery himself? I'm suggesting, Mrs. Henderson said firmly, that a man who beats women is capable of much worse. And I'm suggesting that keeping someone prisoner with threats about their past is exactly what a guilty man would do to ensure their silence. Clara looked at Malachi with new understanding dawning in her eyes. You knew I was innocent. You knew it all along. That's why you never turned me in. Because you needed someone to blame if anyone ever got suspicious about your sudden wealth. Gideon stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. How long have you been planning to frame her if you ever got caught? Malachi's desperate eyes darted toward the door. But Sheriff Davies blocked his path. The walls were closing in and everyone could see it. This is all speculation, Malachi said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can't prove anything. Maybe not, Judge Morrison replied, but we can certainly investigate. Sheriff Davies, I think it's time we had a very thorough look at Mr. Brooks's financial records and a very long conversation about his whereabouts 2 years ago. As the handcuffs tightened around Malachi's wrists for the final time, Clara looked at Gideon with gratitude and something deeper. The recognition that one person's courage had not only saved her from continued abuse, but had uncovered the truth that would finally set her free. The quiet farmer had done more than divide their town. He had revealed its hidden darkness and brought justice into the light.